How about that last panel? I gave them the worst time slot in the world, and I knew they could handle it, and they sure did. And so I told the next one the pressure's on them. And I'm introducing this panel for a couple of reasons. One is because it's undergone more change and makeup than any other. If you'll recall, the earlier agenda you saw on the website and other places had very prominently Commodore MacDonald from the United Kingdom. And in addition to him, we had some other of our closest allies scheduled to come. Well, unfortunately, we learned that they're having an election over there in a couple of days, and they have a law that kind of precludes them from discussing sensitive issues. And I think nuclear policy would be one of those subjects they couldn't discuss. So he was advised to talk with us another day. And so then my friend Jim Blackwell and his associates really helped, and we tried to get some others to fill the bill. And because what we envisioned, quite frankly, is you get the overview from the Strategic Command Commander this morning, and then you would have this tremendous academic panel exploring the threat that we face. And then we had General Klotz give us the whole weapons side of the issue. And then this great panel we had just before by the commanders of the forces. And so we, as I discussed with many of the speakers, and Jim included, we Americans always tend to fall in the trap of believing that others see things the same way we do. And there's plenty of evidence to the contrary. So that's what we were trying to do, is get some different perspective. And what we were attempting to do with this panel is to address the perspectives of our allies, where we are with regard to our strategic partners. So I'm really pleased with the academic emphasis that we've been able to bring to this. And I've never seen so many doctors in one room since I've been in the hospital last. However, as my friend Greg Simon says, we're the kind of doctors that can't do you any good. Jim Blackwell is one of those doctors. He's a scientist. He started his military career, as I did, back in the Army. And even though his service was more remarkable than mine, it still was a long time ago. But he's since had many roles, and you can read his bio and see that he has impeccable credentials to advise and advocate on these issues. And we've assembled a panel of experts that he will introduce to you. I think you will find that sometimes, Jim, it's better to be lucky than good. We had the ability to attract some other great minds to help us explore these issues. So here to introduce his panel and lead the next discussion, Dr. James Blackwell.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. I can assure you this will give you a perspective on allies and adversaries that you would not get in any other venue with the three practitioners that have agreed to do this. Let me set the stage for what I've asked them to do, and then give them an introduction and hand it over to them. By the way, it will be a good panel, Joe. My boss, as he walked by, said, "Don't screw it up, Blackwell." The kind of guidance you get from. The subject for this was chosen to be extended deterrence, so we could take a look at how others perceive the U.S. Deterrent capability. I've titled it to stimulate your thinking. Is it working? Is it working the way it's intended to do? It's a timely topic this week at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference that started Friday, I think, or Wednesday of last week. The Russians marched in with an accusation that the United States is violating the NPT by transferring nuclear weapons to our allies in Europe. The Koreans this week, once again, have tried to make us shake in our boots by alleging that American cities, American targets, are now within their nuclear targeting range. So this question of deterrence at extended ranges for our allies remains an important subject of discussion. Did you know you can be scared to death? You can. It's physiological. Fear can trigger a physiological response. The heart rate rapidly increases, blood pressure goes high, pulse goes up, adrenaline flows, pupils dilate. Also, that the response in the human species becomes fight or flee. And many humans are not equipped to accept the kind of stress that happens, and they are literally scared to death. Now, deterrence comes from the Latin root for fear, and so much of my exploration of the nature of deterrence has been in this psychological domain, what the late Vice Admiral Art Sobrowski once called the cognitive domain of war. If you haven't read his stuff on this, you ought to. And he says, you know, wars are fought in the physical and even in the informational domain, where we kill people and break things. That's the nature of war. It's not changing, despite revolution in military affairs or the transformation of warfare. Remember, he was the director of force transformation. But wars are won or lost in the cognitive domain, where people decide to fight or not to fight. And that's where deterrence and extended deterrence, there is a dimension of extended deterrence and deterrence that is in this cognitive domain that we often neglect. Paul Bracken did us a favor this morning by reminding us that we have to rediscover and reinvent the nature of deterrence. And I think that for the 21st century, this is where we will bear the greatest fruit. This is what I have asked my colleagues to address in the panel today. First is Bob Butterworth. Bob has a pretty unique distinction among all of us. My boss and others are fond of pointing out that Senator Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson, was one of the giants of the strategic deterrence profession. On the Hill, understood it, could get things done. One of Bob's early jobs was as professional staff member to Scoop Jackson. Bob also has a distinguished record in academia doing what I call empirical research. He was in his early days involved in the sources of conflict study, which those of you who've been to grad school for IR know it was an extensive attempt to develop an empirical database for wars and how wars happen and how we might forecast them into the future. In more recent times, he's been a special advisor, as you can see, to combatant commanders, to OSD officials, including Andy Marshall, to the intelligence community. And so I've asked him, he also served at a short tour as a dreaded programmer in PA&E. So his credentials are wide in this area, and I've asked him to take a look at extended deterrence and give us a little bit of insight, if he could, on Asia. Second up will be Bridge Colby. Bridge, you heard someone this morning mention the text that he edited and put together on the nature of strategic stability. I was introduced to his work on the Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, where he did the experts chapter on extended deterrence. one of my favorite studies that I would recommend to you, I don't know if it's out on the streets or not, but he did one for CNA on the nature of nuclear signaling during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, focusing as much on the United States and Russia as he did on Israel, because there's a lot of speculation about what Israel was doing at that time, and the value that Bridge brought to that had to do with the empirical nature of his work. And I would simply say sometimes it's better to have a firmly grounded conclusion that there's not enough evidence to support one argument or the other, as it is to be able to take a firm position. And third is Dr. Chris Yaw. General Wilson mentioned the center he's creating. Chris is another expert among us. He is a physicist by training, an engineering physicist. Worked for a while at Lawrence Livermore. My favorite hero story about Chris Yaw is that when Bob Joseph was approached in 2003 to go into Libya and get whatever Gaddafi was willing to hand over to us after he saw what happened to Saddam Hussein, Chris was on the team that went in to Libya December 03, January 04, with some of the stuff that only someone with a Q clearance could put their hands on. And he got back with all that stuff. He created and ran the degree war games, the deterrence and escalation game and review exercise that was run up at Newport for the Commander Stratcom for 3 or 4 iterations. Never forgiven him for the fact that he always had me as the blue leader either lose. I think once I was able to come to a draw. And he uses those case studies extensively when he teaches airmen about deterrence and escalation control in our various courses. So those are the 3 panelists. As I said, I've asked them to address the basic questions about extended deterrence from the perspective of our adversaries as well as our allies. I've given them a little bit of regional focus, and without further introduction then, I'll start and hand it over to Dr. Bob Butterworth.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to stand if I might.
Yes, please.
Thank you. The reason for that is partly my old back, but it's really because Peter Husey is sitting over there, and I can't quite see him through the pulpit from where I was sitting. Given what I have to say, he's going to be throwing his coffee cup, and I want some warning so I can duck. Thank you very much for all of you who were involved in setting up this meeting, the people with the coalition and everybody else who came. What you're doing is encouraging a hell of a lot more work and better and newer thinking about nuclear issues for the 21st century, and boy, do we need it. And the need for that is actually the main point that I want to make today. But again, I am a former college professor, and so I won't get to that point until I babble on about methodology for about 10 minutes, just to warn you in case you want to step outside for a drink. It was 69 years ago that Bernard Brodie published his famous precept about the consequences of the atomic bomb. I know you've all heard it, I'll just remind you. He said, "Thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them. It can have almost no other useful purpose." Now, it's true, Brodie was well ahead of his time. It wasn't until sometime mid to late 1960s that we had, the mutual deterrence thing going and all that sort of thing. That's fair enough. But the problem that he posed also went far beyond the purposes of a military establishment. It's really a question of statecraft. And we heard that earlier today about whole-of-government kinds of approaches as well. And it's a problem that continues to challenge us to be devilish in our efforts with our international diplomacy. I imagine most people saw Harry Potter movies, and I remember one where he's caught staring into some large ornate mirror, and that was the mirror that had the words written backwards on top that said, "What you'll see in here is not your face, but your heart's desires." That's sort of, so however you pronounce desire backwards, it might be ericid or something. I'm thinking that what we want, if we could possibly have it, an ericid mirror, it would show us our heart's desire in this field, which would be a general principle, a guide to policy and force planning, a formula to tell enemies and allies, and ourselves for that matter, about the military contingencies that might arise if events unfolded along certain lines. But we don't have that mirror. What we do have is a vocabulary deficiency. Brody talked about avert war, but that was soon replaced by deterrence. And deterrence is somewhat narrower, although it does emphasize the military role. But what did it actually mean? In the 1950s, deterrence was implemented through a policy of massive retaliation and a defense program that heavily emphasized nuclear weapons, pre-delegation of authority to use those weapons, preparations to ensure that they could be used preemptively, distribution of intermediate-range missiles under NATO allies' control, with warheads to be armed by the United States, and strategic operations planned to destroy as much of the Soviet state as possible, as fast as possible. As General LeMay put it, you know, if I see those guys getting ready to attack us, you know, I don't care whether I've heard from the president or not, I'm going to hit them with everything I got, and I'm going to kick the shit out of them. That was it. In the 1960s, planning still centered on deterrence, but then it was implemented through a policy of flexible response and a defense program that heavily emphasized conventional forces, centralization of authority over nuclear weapons in the National Command Authority, endless imagineering, particularly in places like RAND and universities and so on, but also in the government, about how nuclear war might be limited, and strategic operations that planned to assure the destruction of an optimal mix of targets that would destroy military and government facilities while still killing an estimated 90 million or so of the Soviet population. And by the way, those 90 million were reported as bonus kills. You know, you read that and you think, ah, those were the days. But the next decade saw deterrence pursued through policies and programs to fight long nuclear wars, the Schlesinger stuff, and after that came policies to use nuclear weapons selectively, to attack or spare civil or strategic command and control facilities, to free ethnic communities for bombing along the lines that would separate those communities from the Russian overlords, to deliver demonstrations of capability or determination, and on and on. My point is that deterrence sounds simple. All we have to do is get somebody who wants to hurt us not to do so. The problem is how. For example, is an enemy more likely to be deterred if we threaten to retaliate massively, or if we do so more proportionately? There was a big argument, largely led by the Air Force in the early 1960s, against flexible response. They wanted the massive retaliation because that's what made deterrence work, and they were convinced of it. Is deterrence going to be better off if we have lots of options for reprisal or not so many? What about if our forces are ready to go at any minute? What about if they require a few days to get them ready to go? What about if our forces are targeted to protect us, counterforce targeting? Or if they're targeted to try to inflict other types of punishment on the enemy? What about if our nuclear weapons are distributed among our forces, as was true in Eisenhower's days? Or what if when they're kept under central control? What if the authority to use nuclear weapons is pre-delegated to the operational forces, or what if it's kept restricted to the president and he has to get that command through? There's arguments on both sides about those things. The answer to each of those questions is, of course, yes or no. Either option might well be the best approach because it depends entirely on the circumstances at hand and how they come to pass. And it's those circumstances that give us fits. That's what we have to deal with. And we're trying to figure out what those circumstances are going to be for the century that we're now in. So deterrence itself is simply a vacuous concept. It is devoid of any meaningful guidance for policy and force planning. As others have noted, deterrence isn't the answer, it's the problem. You know, how do you do it? And I offer you the deterrence JOC, the joint operational concept that the Joint Chiefs have on there, as evidence of that. I think it makes it quite clear. You know, when you read that, you learn that to deter an enemy, you have to make sure that he thinks he will lose more than he gains by doing what you told him not to do. Fair enough? You know, well, that's really very helpful. And if you like that one, I'll give you another one. Buy low and sell high, and you won't have to attend these conferences anymore. Okay. And yet, we can't stop talking about this deterrence stuff. One consequence has been oxymorons that we have to live with, and that tends to undercut some credibility in our policy, like the mad oxymoron. Remember that one? Protecting people makes us less secure. That came up in connection with SALT 1. Protecting people is bad, protecting the forces is good, you know, because of mutual assured destruction. That's okay. We have the sponge oxymoron that, we need to modernize the ICBMs so that we can attract the enemy into striking our homeland with several hundred megatons or something. I mean, now, I'm not complaining about these things being either true or false. I'm just saying they don't obviously make sense for people who are in the business of trying to defend the country. But the more important consequence, I think, has been the declining importance of strategic analysis and military perspectives as factors helping to shape our national policy about nuclear weapons. Because to be operationally meaningful, deterrence requires an intentioned opponent, and preferably it would be one who really delights in savage acts of depravity, to really mobilize us pretty well. Lacking that kind of focus, deterrence policy becomes vague generalizations about imagined contingencies. Now, Putin may yet step up to the mark and help us out. God knows we've been able to depend on the Soviet Union and Russia before to do that. But so far, he hasn't. And for the past couple of decades, then, the controlling voices in our national nuclear policy, I think, have been those concerned primarily with making it ever more difficult to actually use the weapons. That is, the people that don't just want deterrence, they want to make it impossible, if they can, for us to ever use these things. And I offer to you, the UCS pieces that were cited earlier today, the business about de-alerting, and on and on and on. Okay. So at the same time, advocacy for strategic and military perspectives in this field has been reduced many times to just bureaucratic horse trading over budget shares, legislative log rolling to try to help budgets here and there, and fast quips about replying to limited attacks with total destruction. The rationale for modernizing the triad, for example, is often summarized as having two steps. One, we've always had it. Two, it's wearing out. Therefore, we need to spend whatever it takes, to replace it. So what I think we really need is much better advocacy, and that's what I'm after here. Advocacy important is because that's how our system works. You come up and you argue like crazy, and the other guy argues like crazy, and then somebody that you don't even know has gotten hold of a congressman, and that's how he votes. Okay, but we do the best we can. But what it takes is sort of smart advocacy that can actually address national security issues, not just the budget that we currently have and that we're trying to maintain. There's a consequence for this with regard to extended deterrence as well, and that's important for our meeting today. And that has been the friction with our allies and our national security partners. So here we have a posture of deterrence configured for particular circumstances and so on. And we say to, our allies here, fellow sovereigns, we extend to you our deterrence. How about that? But wait a minute, it takes two to do deterrence. We have weapons and we make threats. The other guy decides if he's deterred. So what does extended deterrence actually mean? That's a question that occurs to us, but it sure as hell occurs to our allies and partners as well. Are we doing something that makes sense from their point of view? And if we're not, how credible is the posture that we're trying to adopt? By itself, we in the United States will fill in those blanks in response to an evolving challenge. We may know, or think we know at least, what circumstances will prompt what kind of response, and we certainly appreciate the value of being ambiguous about that because we're not exactly sure what the provocation is going to look like. But we nearly always work with other countries, with our allies, and they've got this really irritating habit of seeing things from their own points of view. They evaluate U.S. proposals in terms of their own interests, and they interpret alliance agreements in terms that make sense to them. It's pretty narrow-minded of them, but that seems to be the way it works. So years ago, for example, it was hard for the European members of NATO to endorse wholeheartedly the U.S. war plans that proposed to defer using nuclear weapons until the conventional forces had been nearly defeated, after which we would use theater nuclear weapons and turn Europe into a radioactive cinder, protecting our homeland and so on. It's a little hard to get them to sign up to that sort of wholeheartedly and so on. The heart of the problem, of course, is that we don't have that technology that gives us the single button that is both a trigger on the U.S. nuclear forces and a safety catch on everybody else's button. And if we could figure that out, we wouldn't have any problems with extended deterrence. The United States, in trying to get out of that problem in NATO, shifted to conventional forces, emphasizing them terribly and making deals with them about a continued presence of American forces and American nuclear weapons on European soil. In East Asia today, we may have to reverse that process. Our allies in South Korea and Japan still welcome the continued presence of American forces, although they move them to different locations probably in the future. And both participate in ongoing discussions about regional security, although the bilateral talks with the U.S. are much more productive than the trilats. Each has supported U.S. efforts to advance security in the region more broadly, most formally with the Philippines, but also with Vietnam, and in different degrees with Indonesia and Malaysia. And you always hope that those things will build a foundation for an effective pluralistic security community in the future. But for nuclear relations, I think the forecast is not so favorable. The U.S. is facing the same magic button problem, aggravated by the distance between our policy pronouncements and our military practices. The tension is most evident in South Korea, where some complain that the sinking of the Chonan, for example, and the shelling of the Yongyang island represent failures of American deterrence, and to be quite blunt about that. As the East Asian context becomes more dangerous, with North Korea's missile launches and its nuclear program, the South Korean forces have been seeking greater autonomy in planning and operations. I know they continue to have the United States maintain the control of the United Force thing if something happens, but in every other respect, they seem to be pressing for greater autonomy. And some in the United States worry that they're doing so in order to be able to trigger a war against the North, regardless of U.S. hesitations about escalation. Their quest for a longer-range ballistic missile might be a case in point. Some even want to go further. Nuclear weapons can be seen as providing an essential degree of independent security for countries that lack, large military resources so that they can confront militarily powerful adversaries better. Recent years have seen calls by some in South Korea and Japan for the development of independent nuclear forces as well. The circumstances here, I think, are different from those in Europe 50 years ago. There, the bumper sticker challenge was whether the United States would sacrifice New York for Paris. Today, the challenge is different. I think the challenge there is whether the United States would ever use nuclear weapons in any event short of its own destruction. I think we have nearly a quarter century of policies, programs, and practices that suggest the answer is no. When U.S. officials talk about deterrence in the East Asia context, they are often referring to conventional forces. And that's how I read that chapter in the 2010 NPR as well, an effort to sort of move the conversation so that it's all conventional. When U.S. officials talk about transparency and confidence-building measures, they're often talking about non-proliferation. When they talk about strategic stability, what they can be talking about is almost anybody's guess. I'll refer you to Bridges' edited book. Recommendations, I think we can do better in all regards. I would personally recommend that we stop talking about deterrence, believe it or not, a term that adds nothing but static to discussions of national security. It means too many things to too many different people. Let's talk, we're military types, we do strategic analysis. Let's talk more precisely. The key to extended deterrence is the formation of a deep community of interests, one so clearly entangling the parties that no one can doubt that an attack on one is going to be an attack on all. So for conventional force issues, let's talk about defense, not deterrence by denial. Let's talk about defense. And let's talk in detail about forces, deployments, operations, logistics, what happens next, and what we want the region to look like in 10 years. Let's talk about force design for the United States. What kind of usable weapons and forces will we want, depending on how we see this problem emerging of smaller nuclear powers who can still be quite dangerous? Let's make sure to include cooperation in space, and we are working on that with maritime domain awareness at least, but let's go beyond that if we can, so that we can develop further joint command and control and so on with the people that we really want to work with in the region. Cyber operations will have to be included to some extent, no doubt, but first we have to figure out how they're going to play in the joint fight, and I think that's something that's, to put it nicely, a work still in progress. And finally, let's also talk about forward deployment of forces that could deliver our only surviving nuclear capability that is not governed by an agreement with Russia, and that is the B-61. Deliverable by F-15s and nuclear-capable successor aircraft that we could park that would be visible in the region, that don't just sort of fly over and go back home again, but are actually there. We may even want to forward deploy some of the bombs, and just as a contingency, we might want to think through how we would want to handle the situation if there proved to be increased pressure for Japan or South Korea developing their own nuclear forces. So what I'm arguing for in general is more strategic and military analysis to make a stronger basis for the policies and programs, to try to develop better clarity in where we want to go, how we see the future looking, and develop more measures that will be able to avert war.
Thank you, Bob. I think Bridge is probably going to speak from his seat. I told you you wouldn't be bored, and that reminds me that I am a Air Force official, and nothing I say represents official policy. The United States government, Department of Defense, the Air Force Global Strike Command, or the United States Air Force, but they're not bound by those rules.
Thanks very much, Jim. I know we're not, fortunately, fascinating talk, Bob. Really very interesting. Thanks to Jim for the invitation and introduction. Thanks to Joe Scholar-Lawrence for and the Strategic Deterrent Coalition. It's a great opportunity and honor to be here talking to such a distinguished and expert group. And I hope to be as halfway as interesting as Bob. Jim asked me to talk about the sort of European perspective and aspect of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence, and I don't have a good English accent, so I won't be able to mimic the Commodore that we hoped to have, but I can see why he didn't want to come, given that the Trident itself may be up for grabs, unfortunately, again. And I'll talk a bit about the sort of European perspectives as I understand them, as well as what I see as some of the key issues beyond, I think, what the Europeans themselves, at least publicly, acknowledge as concerns. You all are very familiar with this in many, I'm sure, cases much more than I, but as you know, the U.S. is in an alliance relationship with more than 24 countries in the Euro-Atlantic area through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This entails extending U.S. deterrence to these allies, as the U.S., of course, is by far the most powerful member state, and this has always included, as Bob related, a nuclear component, although the salience of the nuclear component has varied over the years and has declined markedly, especially since 1991. Now, of course, during the Cold War, the U.S. nuclear force was front and center, relied upon to deter Soviet and Warsaw Pact aggression and coercion in the face of the perception that the Soviets and the bloc enjoyed conventional superiority over the Atlantic Alliance, at least until the very, very end. With the end of the Cold War, the role of nuclear weapons dropped sharply in both the security perception and the Western Alliance's strategy. This meant cancellation or withdrawal of the vast bulk of U.S. nuclear forces in and for European extended deterrence, as well as in the case of the UK and the Brits, the UK and the French. And so what remains are the strategic forces of the United States, the triad, and the strategic forces of Britain and France. In France, a little more questionable given their interesting history with NATO, but also the U.S. Theater nuclear weapons that can be delivered by U.S. and allied dual-capable aircraft that are based in Europe, a relatively small number, but still an important presence I'll talk about in a little bit. So what's been going on since then in the European mindset? Well, obviously there's been a marked decline over the last generation until very recently, which I'll talk about, in a perception of the threat from Russia. And more broadly, an absence of major state threats and a shift towards an interest in counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, out-of-area operations, kind of human security stuff, migration you'll see today is a big issue there. And in terms of NATO itself, there's been more of a focus on the political issues, kind of locking in, so to speak, the political inclusion of the former Warsaw Pact states, and a general shift of the alliance's focus from a security and military organization to a political one. And then a sort of a general sense of security and peace in the European area, especially in Western and Central Europe. Some people call it a security community. Bob Jervis has used that language. And others have talked about a de-Bellicization in Europe, and leading to a declining concern for, interest in, and support for military issues of all kinds, including deterrence and nuclear weapons. So in this period, I would say that nuclear weapons in Europe have either, in the post-Cold War era, have either been neglected or opposed in most European discussion, but I'd say primarily neglected. In the 1980s, of course, as many of you remember, there were huge protests and huge hostility to U.S. nuclear forces and NATO nuclear forces generated by the Pershing and Glickam deployments. But not so much after there's been some disarmament fervor from the Germans, the Norwegians, and others, but it seems a little academic, and I think it's already peaked, the nuclear abolition stuff, especially with recent events. There have been exceptions. I would say the British and French governments, and I would actually commend the French government in particular. I know the French take a lot of heat in the United States, but actually I think their government that deals with strategic issues is very smart. And actually I think a lot of their rhetoric on strategy and deterrence is more consistent, lucid, and sensible than our own, unfortunately. We could take a few cues from them. Also, the Eastern European states, particularly the Baltics and the Poles, have been more sober in light of their more immediate concern about Russia. And Turkey have continued to emphasize the importance of nuclear forces. But in general, there's been a sense of declining relevance of nuclear forces. But even with this neglect and to some extent opposition, NATO has reaffirmed its existence as a nuclear alliance and voted to continue having U.S. nuclear forces in Europe. So that's indicative. But of course, in the last year, this whole dynamic has really changed. I think perceptions in Europe have markedly altered in the last year since the Crimea invasion by Russia. There's a sense across Europe, but especially in Eastern and actually Northern Europe, that Russia is a much more significant threat than had been assessed even a few years ago. Now, there were earlier indications in this direction. There was the Georgia War of 2008, but that seemed a little bit distant. There was Putin's return to power in 2012, and there's sort of authoritarian aspects of that, but that it was an internal matter. But the outright seizure of Crimea late last winter, the quasi-invasion of Ukraine, the markedly stepped up Russian activity in conventional and nuclear-capable forces across the Euro-Atlantic area, and Russia's considerable military modernization effort in the last few years have all substantially changed thinking, although very incompletely. Different audiences look differently. Now, European defense spending remains very low, and there are major quarters throughout Europe, particularly in the south and the east, places like Italy and Spain, and also, most importantly, Germany, that don't see as much of a threat. But I do think that there is more of a sense of a major challenge from the Russians. And I was at a conference last week in Europe, a NATO conference, and I was impressed and somewhat surprised pleasantly that I thought senior NATO officials did have more of a grasp and a willingness to talk about at least the Russian nuclear challenge than I had been led to believe. So that was at least encouraging, but I don't know, is that just NATO military officers talking to each other? I don't get the sense that that's necessarily making its way into the chancelleries of Europe. But the upshot of this is that there is at least some degree of increased interest in the military capabilities of the alliance and the adequacy of the alliance's deterrent against Russia. I'd say most of the attention today is going to U.S. and allied conventional forces, so for instance, the Baltic air policing or rotational missions through the Baltic states, and to general declarations or demonstrations of resolve that the alliance will respond forcefully to any Russian aggression or attempts at coercion against alliance member states. Something like President Obama's speech in Tallinn, Estonia last year. The nuclear component has thus far not received a great deal of attention. In fact, I think quite to the contrary. But while nuclear deterrence, in my view, doesn't get a lot of attention, my sense is, and this has been mentioned a few times in the conference, is that the essential role is implicit. That at least by relevant audiences in Europe, the kinds of audiences that make real security decisions, the U.S. nuclear deterrent is deeply valued and understood, and that it does exercise this kind of shaping influence on defense and foreign policy, but it's little discussed. I think this is in some sense a compliment to the existing, and we should take some satisfaction, or you should take some satisfaction who are responsible for it, from this, because I think it's that the Europeans see the current nuclear force structure as broadly adequate, and I think they take the cue from U.S. officials and officers at this. And so that's where things are right now. But looking forward, I think there are a number of changes that are kind of getting into the water. I mean, one is that the sort of disarmament movement seems to be decreasingly credible. It's interesting to watch the Norwegians, for instance, who were funding a lot of disarmament activities over the last few years, and their foreign ministry is still doing so, but at the same time, their defense ministry is talking more about the challenge from the Russians. The Russians were apparently just bought up a big Norwegian installation just across the border in the Arctic, I think. And the idea of removing U.S. nuclear weapons from Europe, I think now seems to have little traction and to seem vaguely probably absurd. I mean, while the military utility of these weapons is a topic of debate, the symbolism of removing them at this stage would seem very bad, and I think that's pretty recognized. So in that light, the adequate maintenance and modernization of the B-61 bomb will be particularly important as a major signal for the sufficiency of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence in the alliance. And I think the same goes for the modernization of the dual-capable aircraft fleet, and particularly the F-35 and in its nuclear variant, in large part because the major issue here seems to be that it's not at all clear that the Europeans are going to make their next generation fighter bomber nuclear capable. So this will put even more importance on the U.S. having a dual capable aircraft. And we can get into the sort of the value of theater-based weapons if you're interested, but I think that that's reasonably acknowledged. Now, in terms of the broader triad and set of associated platforms and architectures, my sense is the Europeans don't keep particularly current except in very small circles on these issues, particularly in the UK and France. In fact, one is really struck by the thinness of understanding and expertise on these issues in some major countries like Germany and Italy. And the Baltic states and Poland, places where there's more of a sense of threat, I think they have an interest in military issues more broadly, but my sense is there's not a ton of expertise on nuclear issues, and they don't track that quite as closely. There's sort of a sense of broad numbers and that kind of thing, but not a real level of focus. So in some sense, this seems to me, because I think that the triad and the general deterrent capability is so important, this is another example of, I think, in the Europe case where groups like this can promote staying ahead of the problem, that in some sense you're doing well if it hasn't yet become a major concern among key European audiences. So I mean, I think this kind of group is really important and valuable in staying ahead of the curve, because if the survivability of the U.S. deterrent, if the adequacy of the U.S. deterrent does become a serious talking point in discussions with key European governments like Britain and France, then in some sense it's already failed. So I think a group like this kind of looks over the horizon a bit and helps keep us ahead of the problem. So I mean, this is how I sort of look at the kind of broad sense of the U.S. Strategic force. That things are okay right now, but it's vital to keep things adapted to the actual emerging strategic environment, which, given what the Russians are up to in space, cyber capabilities, various kinds of nuclear forces, conventional strike, more active submarine and air operations, that's a not insignificant challenge. But I think there are more problems to this, and here I'm going to go beyond what I think the Europeans would generally say and take a little bit of liberty, but I see where the problem is going to be developing more. And that I think you see now is a Russia that's aggrieved about its place in the post-Cold War order, is prepared to use military force to try to rectify that sense of being molested or treated unfairly, has embarked on a major military modernization campaign over the last few years, and that has yielded a force that can combine the little green men of hybrid warfare that everybody talks about and gets all the media attention, but the part that people don't focus on as much, but is the real problem, is the readily deployable mobile forces that can take advantage of the instability that's the little green men create or exacerbate. And behind that, impressive advanced conventional forces of a range, both ground forces, but also air, space, cyber, maritime, anti-maritime forces. And finally, a modern and diversified nuclear force that can operate in a variety of ways, theaters against civilian targets, but also against military targets. I mean, you hear a lot about, the Russians are threatening Vilnius. In some sense, more of a problem could be Russian nuclear forces that can target U.S. conventional power projection. I can talk a little bit more about that later. But now, obviously, this isn't the Red Army of 1983, but it is a force that's very serious and that I think can sort of exploit or create faits accomplis in Russia's near abroad, and then protect those gains through threats to resort to strategic escalation in order to deter serious and effective responses by the alliance, and particularly by the United States. And don't take it from me. I think this is more or less what the Russians have been talking about, sometimes privately, and have in some respects demonstrated over the last year. And this is where my real concern about the adequacy of the U.S. nuclear force comes in, and where I think one of the areas where this organization could hopefully, sensitize our decision-making more about. Because I asked the question, how well are U.S. and NATO forces prepared for a Russian contingency in which Moscow exploits or creates disorder involving a sympathetic population in, say, Estonia or Latvia, or the Admiral mentioned the Lithuania train issue, and then uses hybrid warfare techniques to seize or suborn NATO member states' sovereignty? The problem here, again, is not the little green men, but that Russia can mobilize tens of thousands of mobile forces, as they have in the Ukraine case, to defend this resistance group in a way that might seem legitimate if they can shape the media environment in a favorable way, and then can back that up with very advanced air defense systems, anti-ship capabilities, counter-space assets, cyber assets, all the way up to a nuclear arsenal with substantial theater nuclear capabilities. So in this context, how would NATO and the U.S. respond if Russia were to say, hey, NATO, your response to this situation should not be, quote unquote, disproportionate, and we understand this to mean no strikes, for instance, against Russian sovereign territory. Now, as you know, the Baltic states are tiny, right? So how would NATO take down the air defense systems, the anti-ship cruise missiles, the theater or kind of tactical local command and control that NATO and the Americans would need to do to take down, to establish, or degrade at least, to establish aerospace and maritime superiority, since these Russian forces could easily operate from Russian territory? And I don't need to tell this audience that the absolute foundation of American military superiority is the aerospace, domination, right? Dominance. I mean, if we don't have command of the air and space and the electromagnetic spectrum, then our way of doing things, or your way of doing things, doesn't really work. And that has enormous consequences. And now, ultimately, even if the Americans decided, or NATO decided, to ignore this, the Russians could threaten to escalate to the strategic level to try to dissuade NATO from mounting an effective response to this kind of scenario. Now, Russia, as many of you know, has openly talked of an escalate to de-escalate doctrine in which it would use limited nuclear strikes, for instance, against military forces or against very valuable forces, or it might use what you might call strategic conventional strikes to spook the alliance into backing down. And I should say, I think it's a very smart strategy, actually. I'm kind of a little jealous. And it has also repeatedly exercised what look to be at least variants of this approach, meaning that Russian forces are relatively well prepared to deal with something like this. I emphasized the word relatively. How well prepared are American and alliance forces to deal with this kind of scenario? I don't know the answer, but hopefully somewhat. So now this kind of scenario, which isn't implausible, I emphasize, and ask the Balts or the Eastern Europeans about this, is challenging enough. I mean, are we ready to go toe-to-toe with the Russians in this kind of situation? This brings up Bob's question about whether the U.S. is willing to go to nuclear war to defend its allies. My sense is I hope so, at least in some circumstances, but it would be pretty nervy, to say the least. But the thing is, it's not just about will, and that's where the SDC comes in, I think. Do we have the capabilities that would be best suited for this kind of scenario? I'm not fully convinced. Maybe we do right now, but looking out over the kind of procurement horizon. Because what we'd want is the credible ability to respond to Russian-tailored nuclear use or strategic conventional use with strategic conventional or discriminate nuclear strikes of our own. That is, we want the Russians to see that we have the ability to respond to their limited nuclear use with limited nuclear use of our own, meaning nuclear use that isn't completely apocalyptic or crazy, since that isn't very credible and in the event would probably be a bad idea. Now, this would mean nuclear use designed to signal to the Russians that we are willing to match their escalation and to do to them the same or a similarly painful kind of damage that they might threaten to do to us. Of course, the point of such capabilities is precisely so we don't have to use it. I mean, I don't need to tell this audience that the point of nuclear forces is precisely to avoid having to use any kind of major military force, particularly nuclear weapons. But the point is to show the Russians that such a course of action would just call forth a comparable response of our own and would be insanely risky and dangerous to boot. Now, right now, the ability to do this kind of thing, as you well know, this kind of limited nuclear operations is heavily concentrated in the bomber force, which we're here at near Whiteman Air Force Base, amazing aircraft, as you all well know better than I. But my understanding, and I shudder to say this in front of an Air Force audience, but I think the B-2 is going to have to deal with the fact that there are increasingly advanced surface-to-air missile threats of a variety or general IADS threats. I'm not exactly sure. I imagine there are a number of ways of dealing with the B-2. And that's, that's a function of technology and the fact that the airplane was built in the 80s and 90s. So the LRSB is hugely important because of the capabilities that are particularly resident in this force in a penetrating aircraft that can go deep into an adversary and hold at risk those key targets. Now, I think in light of the advancing air defense challenge of a variety of kinds, I think the LRSO is also very important. And I think the Air Force, shouldn't necessarily be shy about saying, yes, the LRSB will be penetrating aircraft. Yes, we're confident in it. But, in something like this, we don't believe in betting the farm. So we're also going to have a cruise missile option. I don't think that's so crazy. And I think that'll, the LRSO seems to be a pain point or risk point in my discussions with people on the Hill and who followed the policy discussion. But I think, I think the Air Force can be frank about that and say, look, we're realistic, right? But, it's more than just platforms, as you well know. It's also planning capabilities, doctrine, and more broadly, a mindset that thinks about and deals with these kind of challenges and these kinds of realities. And this gets, I think, some parts of what Bob said I almost entirely agreed about. I like the word deterrence, so that one quibble. But what I really agreed with is although I agree with Jim, it does come from the root of the word terror. And I heard Tom Schelling talk about this, that there's really, it is about fear, and that's why I sometimes quibble with the deterrence by denial. But anyway, that's a digression. But, the point is that I think that this kind of a group can encourage what we need from our government and our, in a sense, our policy discussion, which is that we should convey to the Russians that we are the kind of people who would be willing to use nuclear weapons. I mean, at some level, it's kind of that simple, and to the Chinese as well. Now, one of the things that's great about having advanced capabilities is you're asking less of the president or the decision maker's resolve, right? If there are more exquisite or discriminate or boutique or tailored capabilities, that puts less weight on his or her resolve, and our willingness to go to the brink. But I think one of the great things, one of the things that this group can do is not just advocate for platforms, but inject the nuclear element more into the discussion, so it's not seen as some kind of bizarre ghettoized part of the broader defense policy discussion, but something that, hey, is part of plausible warfare, and more to the point that conflict is really possible, unfortunately. And I think that that's something that, when I go to Europe, I mean, it's changed a lot in the last year, but this is a part of the world where I think people have been seriously making the argument that conflict could really be eliminated from human existence, or the threat of conflict. And I think, the future is unlikely to be like the recent past, in the sense that, my view is American power, for good, I think largely for good, not all of it, but, American power has been a crucial element in the stability and the peace of the last, 30 years, right? People just, even if they were ambitious and unhappy, they knew that they couldn't take on the Americans and win, right? So it was this dumb idea. But as the global military environment becomes more competitive, as technology diffuses, that's going to be less likely to be true. That means conflict is more plausible, and that means nuclear weapons are also plausible and need to be thought about and need to be kind of constructed or postured in ways that show that they could credibly be used if we're going to continue to have that kind of benevolent peace that we've had for some years. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bridge. Didn't have to use my card.
I saw
Chris.
All right. Thanks, Jim. I just wanted to thank, and I'll be pretty brief because this provides some fairly compelling grist for the mill, and I want to see that mill work. And after all, I am just a tack on. So, but my thanks to Joe Scalorns, Chuck Ambrose, the SDC, and UCM for crafting such a compelling symposium. Thanks to our military partners, of course, who are here and who are actively engaged in generating deterrence, the very things that we're talking about here every single day. And I would, in that vein, commend such a track to our ROTC colleagues in the back there. Consider going into this career field. So I'm here both as Director of Cadence, shameless plug, here's the the trifold, new trifolds. That is the Center for Assurance deterrence, escalation, nonproliferation, science, and education. And really, it is a nonprofit nuclear think tank, put quite simply. It's a center within the Louisiana Technology Research Institute, and so I can speak in that capacity. I no longer have to make the same caveat that Jim made. I am not in the government anymore. So, but that said, I'm eager to join with elements of the government, like Stratcom's Academic Alliance that Admiral Haney mentioned earlier today. I know it's Cinco de Mayo, but belatedly, because I'm a geek, may the 4th be with you. Sorry, I had to. I don't have any prepared remarks, so I'll be pretty brief, and I'll try to inject a little bit of discipline to this otherwise undisciplined mind. So the topic that I received was the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence. I hope it's still the topic. Are adversaries still shaking in their boots, right? Are the allies under the umbrella getting wet? Okay, good. It's still the topic. The one issue here is the umbrella got a lot bigger in the last 20 years. And that comes along with two corollaries. First, now we have to manage disparate values, cultures, and interests. An example here was touched upon very lightly today, the difference between an Estonia and a Hungary. Hungary, which their political leadership tends to lean, at least recently, strongly in the Russian direction, and Estonia, where the political leadership leans distinctly away and is, in fact, fearful of the Russian bear sitting right outside the border. So that could come into play when we start talking about extended nuclear deterrence in the case of a consensus needed for Russian aggression in crisis or conflict. NATO has to work off of a consensual basis. If we have one nation holding out, Hungary say, despite Estonia's pleas, that could be a problem for NATO. This doesn't even get into the Middle East. I know we've talked about Middle East a little bit here today, not a lot, but that presents, to my mind, almost an impossible degree of difficulty when you start talking about coupling. And we used to talk about strategic theater, strategic coupling back in the Cold War days when we used to think about this a lot. But the point is you have to be able to couple theater responses and theater forces to strategic responses. And if that coupling is not there, that is, if you're not willing to take the conflict all the way to strategic levels and risk shots on the U.S. homeland, then you're not sufficiently coupled in order to give a warm fuzzy to the ally. Because that means you're not really, you're the chicken at breakfast, you're not the pig. To mix in another analogy. You know, the chicken lays the egg, but the pig is fully committed, right? Okay, it's also provoking of a response, and particularly in the case of Russia and NATO expansion, and they have some fair points. I think we did make it pretty clear to them at the end of the Cold War that we weren't going to take advantage of them and expand NATO, and then we did because it looked like a great idea. I mean, there were a lot of political benefits to it, and we went right up, within a stone's throw of St. Petersburg, which did nothing to endear them to us. And then we discounted all of their objections in the Balkan conflict, et cetera. So there was a lot going on. That umbrella then provoked a response. And now you could look at this and say, well, that's a little bit different than there was another response, and it was in 2001, and it was a response from China when asked on, I think it was 60 Minutes or something like that, President Bush was asked, well, how far are you willing to go on the whole defending Taiwan thing? And he said, whatever it takes. Well, that was a pretty unambiguous statement by the President of the United States. Afterwards, it was a little qualified by the handlers and the spinmeisters. And, of course, well, what the President really meant to say was ... But he said it, and they heard it. And so in their calculus, they're thinking, Maybe we'll wait a few years before we can contemplate anything on the island of Taiwan. Okay, so that's a bit of the unambiguous. Allies aren't getting wet yet. So to answer that other question pointedly, they're not getting wet, but they're worried they might. Why? Well, because it's raining now. So it's easy when the sun is shining to stand under the umbrella and think happy thoughts. But when it starts raining, you start thinking about just how wide is this umbrella? And what if the wind picks up and it does one of those umbrella flippy things and I start getting wet? So that's when you start worrying. And I would say our NATO allies are starting to worry. It's a little bit about the action-reaction principle, the classic security dilemma. The issue here is that the umbrella, and this is funny, it doesn't happen in real life, but our umbrellas don't affect the weather. But this umbrella actually affects the weather. Whether it's raining, how hard it's raining, whether the wind is blowing, the umbrella actually affects the weather in this case. And so that really requires a lot more thinking, I think, than we have done in the past, at least in the past couple decades. A couple future cautions. First is the testing of resolve and perceived stake, particularly early in a conflict with the potential for highly selective theater nuclear employment for terminal de-escalation. Both Russia, who's quite open about this theory, as Bridge mentioned, and China, who's much more circumspect, we have to worry about both of those cases. And here I'd commend a doctrinal document, now a few years old, called The Science of Second Artillery Campaigns. That's a Chinese doctrinal document. I recently testified on this in Congress in April, and I highlighted another oxymoron, which also Bridge made mention to, escalate to de-escalate. You know, there's all these kind of strange oxymorons. It really threw folks for a loop. But one key here to recognize is a potential asymmetry of escalation philosophy. It's not so, we have an escalation philosophy, and when we look in the mirror, we see ourselves. The problem is a lot of times we look at China and we think we're looking in a mirror, or we look at Russia and we think we're looking in a mirror. Their escalation philosophy is not the same as ours. That's okay. We can deal with that unless we don't realize it beforehand. If we don't realize it, then we may be in for a very rude awakening when the first de-escalatory nuclear strike happens. So okay that we don't have the same escalation philosophy, but let's be very realistic about what our opponent's escalation philosophy is. Second future caution. We need agility, resilience, and flexibility as we look forward with respect to highly evolving and non-apocalyptic, as Bridge mentioned, nuclear weapon developments. And here there's a few come to mind. You think of the potential for very short range, possibly even nuclear artillery and special munitions in North Korea. And there's historically been a good connection on the nuclear front between Pakistan and North Korea. And Pakistan is working on those types of systems. Nuclear artillery, very short range, shoot and scoot type of battlefield rockets. It's very conceivable that that technology, that know-how is bleeding back into North Korea. So that would be a problem. And we have to respond to that. Another one would be potentially ICBMs in North Korea requiring perhaps more robust missile defense. So say the time comes when in a few years they have 100 nuclear weapons, 50 of which are now on ICBMs that deploy, penetration aids. Okay, well now you're talking about some real problems, and this country could have to make the decision, yes or no, to go to a nuclear-tipped interceptor system. Can we do that? I don't know. Clean sheet nuclear weapon design hasn't been done in this country in a long, long time. Another possibility would be INF withdrawal by Russia, followed by a rapid fielding of an INF force. Think about our allies here in the SS-20 back in the 70s. Hypersonic nuclear weapons by Russia and China. Does that lead us to a symmetric response or not? And so here, this flexibility and resiliency is underscored by again, as Bridge mentioned, the LRSB and LRSO. Those are our most flexible, resilient, responsive types of forces in the entire nuclear arsenal. So without those, we'll be dead in the water facing these kind of new environments. Now, that doesn't mean that they are sufficient. Those, I would say the LRSB and LRSR are necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. So we should prepare ourselves for even more potentially. And the SDC can help by making that kind of a point on a regular basis to legislators as well as executive branch. Looking to the future, I would just make quick mention of UCM's motto, Education for Service. I think I saw it on the podium there. And I would suggest to the audience that a more energetic, widespread, mission-focused, world-class research in the fields of deterrence, assurance, escalation, non-proliferation, it contributes to these very areas that we're talking about, particularly when done by those who support the continuing health of the nuclear security enterprise. We've mentioned a lot of global zero this and global zero that. There's, for one reason or another, a lot of resources going toward global zero-ish types of arguments. And we need to be prepared to make the counter arguments in a more robust way. And then I guess finally, just to underscore the one last point, importance of private citizens involved with their congressional delegations. That's, I think, critical and a piece that I think the SDC can facilitate, facilitating private citizens making the point to their elected officials that this is very important to them, and not just because of jobs, but jobs are at stake in some cases, but because of the security of the nation depends on it. And I yield my time.
Thank you, Chris. And in order to make sure there's time to change the table for the final panel, I'll just go directly to questions from the audience, and I'll just, if you'll just raise your hand. I won't exercise prerogative chair, but if you don't have one, I've got one that will stump these guys. Nothing controversial about what my panelists have said. So let me ask this. Chris, you hinted at the end that the ICBM is probably not the more flexible tool. So each of you take a moment to tell us what you think is the role of the ICBM and the GBSD for the future in extended deterrence as opposed to core deterrence. What do you think? Bob? Start with Bob.
Well,
and just go down the table.
yeah, I would have to say, Jim, that I think there's a brilliant suggestion in the recent issue of Strategic Studies Quarterly as the lead article there that can give us a great deal of help. I don't remember the name of the author off the top of my head, but
the next article below, everyone, I'm sure.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, actually, they are compatible, properly understood. Anyway. So I'll defer then to Bridge.
What Bob's referring to is actually a very provocative piece he wrote in Strategic Studies Quarterly, arguing for a more flexible ICBM force with conventional warhead options. That is not to say prompt global strike, but conventional Minuteman. And I won't try to characterize the argument, but it's a very different way of looking at GBSD for the future and quite provocative.
Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think the ICBM, the arguments are pretty well known, but it plays a vital role as the kind of, large scale, very difficult to target, confident communications. It's the end of this sort of escalatory ladder along with the ballistic missile submarine. You have some redundancy there. So, and I think that makes sense for extended deterrence too, because extended deterrence, as Chris rightly puts out, is on a continuum with central deterrence. And so, if you don't have the ICBM, or if you have, then you have what, a dozen, maybe a few more total targets that the adversary has to deal with. And I was at one of the labs a year or so ago, and we were talking about, open ocean stuff. Who knows? People have been talking about it for years, but I mean, a lot of changes are happening technologically, and I wouldn't want to put all our eggs in one basket. So, I mean, I think we should be, there are a lot of different ways of looking at it, budgetarily. as well, but I think it's absolutely, and again, I mean, I think I think Wilson was saying it, just this is a very reasonable cost. I mean, I look at it as an insurance issue. Yeah, it's unlikely in this, right? Whatever unlikely means, which is a contextual assessment, but it's something that, for the cost, I think is very reasonable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think totally agree. It presents the adversary with an enormous escalation hurdle to conceive of, apocalyptic scale of escalation. Anything short of that kind of nerve, and as I think somebody mentioned today, it would be the last decision they would make. And in fact, it would be a hard decision to make. So, but beyond that, it also incentivizes, if you have no ICBM leg, that would incentivize the adversary to go first quickly in a conflict. When you only have a dozen or so nuclear targets, go ahead and wipe those out so you have permanent upper hand in the conflict. That is crisis stability, and so you would go from a stable system to a very unstable system without the ICBM. Additionally, you would incentivize the adversary to figure out how to make the oceans transparent. If they haven't figured it out already, you will make sure that you've properly incentivized them to do just that. Just like if we eliminated the subs, you'd incentivize an adversary to figure out, how do I take out all those ICBMs without going nuclear? Either way, you're going to incentivize someone to do something. That's what makes the triad so strong.
Dr. Butterworth, sir, Rich Clark, 8th Air Force. So I was trying to think how to ask this question, but when you talked about the fact that you did not adhere to the deterrent word, and when we're talking about nuclear weapons, I mean, they are inherently offensive weapons, and I understand the thought that when we're talking about conventional forces, you do adhere to the thought of defensive posture or defense. But how can we talk about nuclear weapons really and how they would be used in a defensive way without talking deterrence? I'm having a hard time getting my arms around that one. Can you expound on that a little?
Well, I can expand on what I meant anyway.
Yes, sir.
Whatever it was that I actually did say. It's on video. So, deterrence, it's very simple, and I was just building off Jim's first point, I thought, which was it's a psychological thing. So, he can't exercise deterrence over me. He can have a weapon, maybe he doesn't need one, and he can make a threat. If I respond to that, my response to that is what determines whether deterrence happens or not. And I guess my problem, if I might go on just a little bit beyond that, it's not because I like grammar or I was an English teacher. It's because I think we confuse ourselves in our own discussions. So we start talking about the deterrent as though it was and always was exactly what it is now. But of course it wasn't, and of course we want people to avert war, to not attack us in the future, but it might well be a different force. And so as we use the term, particularly when we try to deal with our allies, I think, we tend to not be sensitive enough to what it is that we're conveying when we use that term. Whereas if we stick to, deployments and operations and conditions under which we're training and joint forces and that kind of thing, that's pretty clear. Is that responsive?
Can I expound?
But Bridge wants deterrence back, so.
Well, it's an interesting. I mean, I want to. I think I think I understand, or part of what you're saying, which is that deterrence, the word deterrence and other words like it, can serve as a kind of short-circuiting of thinking, kind of thinking the unthinkable, about thinking about how these kind of conflicts would actually go and how you would actually coerce your adversary, whether through actual force, the threat of force, or some combination, right? And a little bit is, to me, I think in this day and age, actually deterrence itself is actually, I mean, let me step back. One of the things that I think would be actually very useful, and I've sort of tried to, well, I've suggested this to some Pentagon people, and it wasn't my idea, but is for the Secretary of Defense or a senior defense official, not just to give a speech about the importance of nuclear deterrence, right? When Secretary Gates gave this speech in 2008, to even talk about nuclear deterrence was actually itself a signal that there was some degree of seriousness about thinking about this. So unlike maybe in 1975 when it was a little bit, when it was more anemic, but you know, what would be great in light of what's happened in the last year would be for a senior defense official to give a real speech about nuclear employment strategy.
Yes.
You know, and to say, and I would be fine. You know, deterrence is great. I think because I'm kind of where you are, General, in the sense that like I think you are too. We'd like to avoid this war, but we have to think pretty hard about it. And if somebody gave a speech like Jim Schlesinger gave, or Cap Weinberger gave, or Robert McNamara gave, that would signal not just the Allies, but I think it would signal to the guys in Moscow or Beijing that this is the kind of thing that we are actually seriously thinking about, with the goal being deterrence and stability, but those things not, you know, I mean, the way I feel about it is like when sometimes people use the word toolkit about nuclear weapons. It's like, well, I mean, it's not something you keep in a toolkit. It's like more like, you know, it's kind of a savage thing, you know, and you kind of don't want to give the impression that you're afraid to talk about. I mean, I'm not trying to beat my chest here, but I think it's important that American officials seem to the Kim Jong-uns of the world that they're not trying to avoid confronting the reality of what they're talking about. And so I think that's, you know, maybe we're saying kind of similar things, although we have different views on the precise word deterrence.
Chris, do you want to add something to the deterrence I'm sorry, Bob.
After Bob.
You wanted to respond?
I just wanted to say that sounds to me pretty good. But for example, your own presentation, Bridge, you know, you're talking about, but you were very precise about what you were talking about, the ability to deny this and this kind of thing. Or maybe another way to put it, General, is that, you know, I liked the Pentagon and I liked working there when it was easier to tell the difference between OSD and the State Department. Sorry, go ahead.
Nicely put, Bob. Yeah, anything's anticlimactic. So I would agree, and kind of to underscore that point, while the NPR certainly has its highlights, the 2010 NPR, one of the things that I think perhaps inadvertently it did was when it uses the language, in fact, the U.S. wishes to stress that it would only use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances, ... When we go out of our way to make sure everyone knows we have an extreme aversion to using nuclear weapons, although, hey, look, no one really wants to use nuclear weapons, right? But when we go out of our way to say we stress that we'll only consider them under the most extreme circumstances, that incentivizes allies, adversaries, the Chinas and the Russias of the world, to start contemplating what exactly are those circumstances. They're wishing to stress that it's got to be really, really bad before the U.S. is going to think about using these. Well, we could probably use, I don't know, one or two, or maybe an EMP strike, or you know, maybe a few battlefield ones, or maybe we could take out an aircraft carrier because no civilians die, and after all, we could do that with 4 good torpedoes anyway. So you start allowing the adversary to go down a path you do not want the adversary to go down. That would be my my add to that.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. We call them something doomsday weapon or something like that. We'd get better results because people would be more on edge. I mean, they would respond differently.
Yes, sir. The suggestion was if we called them doomsday weapons, we might get better results. I guess I'd have to think about that a little bit, because I also, believe it or not, sort of like the idea of an idea that Bernard Brody spent some time on, and others have too, that a tactical nuke here and there can actually help to end a conflict, and we might want to look at that again for the future situation of extended deterrence.
But
that's a whole separate book.
Because I think it's important, because I actually like the extreme circumstances language, both because I do think it's, you know, look, I think these weapons are, what makes deterrence ultimately work, nuclear deterrence I think ultimately work, is the prospect of it being connected to that apocalyptic. And in a sense, to me, the way you would make a limited nuclear use work is you would be showing the adversary that you're willing to go down that path. Now, there are certain strategies that you could use within that. Yeah. But actually, from a strategic point of view, saying I'm only going to use these in extreme circumstances, if you use one, that means that you're really serious, that this is, I mean, in some sense, maybe we're saying the same thing, General, but that if and I think that's what it should be. It should be, essentially, if we use a nuclear weapon, an adversary should basically understand that it's crossed a line that it really didn't expect to cross, and now should de-escalate the situation. Now, doing that, doesn't just mean, testing a weapon somewhere. It may, I think it actually means using it in a way that has some military utility. But the fundamental point of it, I think, is to demonstrate how serious we are. So it's more of a, and that may be a different.
I think I would agree that when we use it, we want to convince the adversary that they have misjudged just how grave the U.S. sees this issue. However, beforehand, if we allow them to contemplate just how grave it has to be, we run the risk of them using it once or twice or three times before we actually compel them to understand how grave
So
it is.
it pains me to have to cut our discussion off as it's just getting going, and Professor Curtis, I owe you, but So yeah. I am quite confident that my three panelists are indeed thinking in the context of Paul Bracken's multipolar context, although it's hard to break out of those thinking patterns, isn't it? And so if I could just bring us to a conclusion and allow the next panel to get up here, I'll just say this, that what this dialogue and debate represents is, I think, indeed, deterrence is at the cognitive domain of war, and we better get our evidence and our reasoning and even our language more accurate and precise in order to deal with this world that is becoming more proliferated and more dangerous. So thank you to all three of you panelists for taking this on, and thank you, audience, for engaging.